When people think about restoring ankle mobility, they're usually referring to dorsiflexion, where the shin, the tibia right here, translates over the foot. This occurs during mid-stance phase of gait, and this is also really important for all forms of human locomotion. If we don't have the ability to go into dorsiflexion, then we can't achieve force into the ground, and we can't then create the lengthening of the arch, and then the subsequent spring back up to create that push off of the forefoot. Most people want better ankle mobility for squatting, but we also need better dorsiflexion and the subsequent pronation that occurs with that to achieve internal rotation, feeding from the foot all the way up to the hip. If you're an athlete that needs to be able to move well, or if you're someone suffering from something like plantar fasciitis or some sort of Achilles issues, this is usually a consideration. Let's break down what dorsiflexion is. We cannot have the ability to achieve proper dorsiflexion without this arch dropping. Dorsiflexion and pronation of the foot are two inherently coupled joint actions. You can't really have one without the other, and if you don't have one, you're probably going to find a compensation or compensatory strategy to achieve what you don't have, and we'll talk about what that looks like in a second. But the point is when we strike the lateral border of our heel, we're biased towards more external rotation of the tibia and more supination of the foot. And then we go into the midfoot. It's more of this diagonal line to the ball of the big toe right here, where we go into pronation. And then as we get to the big toe, we resupinate and spring that arch back up. But the purpose of this video is to go into a little bit more detail in terms of what types of people I see struggle with pronation and what these presentations look like and also turn out like within assessment processes, and what we can do to then restore that dorsiflexion and pronation. The two most common foot types that I see that are biased towards this limitation of pronation or are compensating into pronation when they walk or just stand statically are the following. The first is that we have more of this high arch, and I think that this makes sense. If your arch is very rigid and high and it can't yield into the ground, then we're probably not going to be able to achieve a proper internal rotation strategy. For those that are aware of the terminology, this is your classic narrow infrasternal angle. These people are biased towards external rotation of the hip, which feeds down the chain into external rotation of the tibia, and these people are going to have a relatively higher arch to start. So when these people just stand, they're probably going to have a relatively higher arch. They're probably not going to be able to push their knee very far over their toe, and if they do, that arch is not going to drop very much. We'll get into assessments in just a second, but this feeds into the next foot type that I see, and this is people who are pushed very far forward. Like I said earlier, if we don't have the ability to achieve a strategy that we need to move, we're going to take the path of least resistance, and that often involves pushing our weight forward onto our toes, so that way we can push ourselves forward better. But what this often does is this creates excessive tibial external rotation, because if we think about what push-off is, it's external rotation. But we can achieve this compensatory flattening of the arch and pronation by going very far forward, because what that's going to do when we just regularly stand, we're not going to be able to literally be on our tiptoes all the time. We're not going to be able to just have our heels off of the ground. So what's going to happen is our center of mass is going to be pushed forward, and one of two things is probably going to happen. We're going to probably have some degree of this tibia turning out, which is going to collapse that back ankle into the ground. And that can feed into even more external rotation where this foot literally turns out, and then you can strike the ground on the inside edge of the foot and pronate better. But this is not a foot that can genuinely access pronation. This is a foot that actually is still limited in pronation. Oftentimes these people will present with their weight very far on their toes. They're going to have toes that are turned out, or the whole foot is turned out with it. But regardless, you're probably going to see some degree of these toes migrating outwards, because that's a representation of what happens when we're in late stance and push off. These toes actually go in a little bit as we push off. So these people oftentimes also have some degree of bunions on the front side of their foot right in here, because what they're really doing is constantly pushing that into the ground to achieve that compensatory pronation strategy, and then you get that callus that builds up over time. So what are we going to see in terms of actual assessments? Well, with either of these cases, what we're probably going to see is a limitation in the ability to just do a basic dorsiflexion test where their foot is about a fist length away from a wall and they're trying to push that tibia and knee forward, keeping the 3 points of contact of this big toe, little toe, and also the heel. They're probably not going to see too much real pronation. They're either going to be very stiff with their arch or that arch is going to collapse a lot more than it probably should, and you're going to see that ankle roll in. The other measurement that we're going to see a limitation in is knee flexion. And we can measure this by laying down on the ground, keeping something underneath our pelvis and hips to neutralize our pelvis so we're not starting an excessive extension, and trying to pull the heel towards the butt. We would want at least 130, if not all the way of the heel coming towards the butt, and that would be a representation of the ability to internally rotate that tibia. So if that measurement improves, then we know we're on the right track, because the inverse of knee flexion would be locking out the knee, and that is tibial external rotation with relative femoral internal rotation. Another assessment you can use to determine the difference between these two most common types of the foot presentation is that people that have this high rigid arch are oftentimes going to be biased towards more external rotation, right? Because a higher arch is associated with that external rotation of the tibia. So these people should have a lot more external rotation of the hip as well. We can measure this through hip flexion. If they get 120 degrees of hip flexion and it looks pretty clean, then that's an indication that this person probably is just missing internal rotation from the hip down into the foot for that pronation and dorsiflexion. But if you see someone that has these toes that are flared out and the ankle is collapsed in, they're probably going to be very forward onto their toes, and that means that they're going to be pushed forward within their pelvis, meaning that they're probably limited in hip flexion. So you're going to see a lot of 90 degrees of hip flexion with these types of people. They usually don't get beyond 100 degrees. Let's go with the very compensatory person first, because that's going to require a little bit more of a slower start. These people need to find the lateral border of their heel so that they can begin the process of bringing that center of mass back and the ability to go from external rotation to internal rotation and then back into external rotation upon push-off. Something that would be very helpful is getting them the ability to find their heels, hamstrings, and control that posterior tilt of the pelvis. That needs to be the first step in many cases, and this is a very basic exercise where you can do that. After that, we want to provide a dynamic ability to go from external to internal rotation. But because these people are very far forward on their toes, we want to start them with the ability to sense that tibia backwards in space. And we can do that via elevating the foot on a wedge, as I've mentioned in the pronation video. So as we go forward here, we're going to allow for this tibia to start in a relatively backwards facing position, which is external rotation, and then we can achieve better pronation because we're not going to be starting on the ground where we're already collapsed and trying to jam more of this internal rotation further forward onto this foot that cannot accept it because it's compensating into it. Another really effective strategy for this would be to elevate the foot on some sort of small surface like a book and then float the toes, because what that's going to do is that's going to allow for us to start, due to the elevation, a little bit more of this backwards tibia angle. Then we can go forwards without going too far onto our toes, which is going to promote a good bit of that real pronation and the ability to get the tibia translating forward without going too far onto the toes, which is what they oftentimes want to do. And if you wanted to make that even more dynamic and load it, you could do a front foot elevated split squat with a same side or ipsilateral load, because that's going to allow you to achieve more of this outside heel contact to start, but then you're going to be able to push into internal rotation of that tibia, because that's what a same side load does. It allows you to go more forward with that tibia. One of my favorite loaded and dynamic activities for restoring pronation is a lateral sled drag. And this is something I originally got from Bill Hartman, who is a great resource, and people seem to really enjoy this activity as well. So what this does is it causes the foot to sense a push off of the inside edge so that we can couple that propulsion through internal rotation, and we can do that where we are leaning off to the side a little bit so we can leverage more of the inner edge of this foot, and we can then get that yielding of the arch into the ground to push. I found this to be very successful after we bring them back onto their heels, if that is a necessary step, which it often is with people who are very much forward on their toes. After you do some of these activities, retest the associated measurement you're trying to improve and see what happened.